Hi, everyone. This is Conscious Leaders, a new conscious working series where we talk to leaders and their advisors about the world of work. We'll be covering the essence of leadership and how different management styles have met the challenges of the pandemic and its mass disruption. In it, we examine what's changed in the workplace, new techniques and initiatives designed to support hybrid, as millions attempt to integrate work from home with some office life. Joining me today is Becky Falkingham, CEO of the Alexander Partnership, a leading advisory firm that has been coaching C-suites across some of the biggest businesses in fashion and countless other sectors for decades. Hello, Becky. Thanks for joining.
Hi. Hi, nice to see you.
So obviously we know each other well, full disclosure to everyone. Becky, you were actually my coach. So we were normally talking about me. This time we get to talk more about you. So let's start there with a little bit of your background. You started in retail and strategy consulting. How and why did you transition into executive coaching?
It was a long sort of journey. I loved the strategy consulting, but we got frustrated a lot of the time by providing fantastic strategies for organizations, but the people weren't either ready for the change that it needed, or weren't able to sort of lead the way that it needed to be led. And so that drove me at first actually into headhunting, just looking at talent, and then into coaching. And I love coaching because it's so refreshing, energizing for both them and for me. And every day is different. So every client's different, every situation's different, but you feel like you're sprinkling some magic of positivity and hope and some skills around different organizations and different individuals, and making a difference, which I just love. So it's fun.
And to get into the C-suite, obviously you don't just directly open that door. Was it hard to get into the room?
Well, actually, it's interesting. I've thought about that. My father was a very senior leader. So he ran part of a big multinational food company. And from a very early age, I was mixing with very senior people. So I didn't see it as difficult to have a really open and challenging conversation with a very senior chairman, even when I was sort of 20. So from day one, I didn't feel uncomfortable. But then when you're in strategy consulting from a stupidly early age, to be really honest, you're sitting in front of CEOs when you're in your 20s and giving them advice, which quite frankly, in retrospect, is a bit crazy. But you're in there already. So you've been given permission by the role you're doing. And then when I was headhunting, I was really focusing on board work. So I was doing CEOs and non-execs and chairmen. So I got to understand boards. I got to sit in boards. I didn't ever run a business until Alexander, but I guess I was part of the boardroom network, if you like, from a fairly early age. So it was a very natural evolution. And so the questions that are on the minds of CEOs and the questions that are being raised in the boardroom have been in my sort of on my agenda from the very, from the beginning, whether it's strategy or leadership or, the talent issues or whatever, as well as the governance of and how it works, because there is quite a difference between how a board works and how an exec team works, and in different sectors. So we have a lot of PE-backed businesses, but we also have a lot of PLC businesses that we work with, and they're all very different, but I've just over time got to know them.
I mean, it's really interesting that actually it's having that comfort obviously means you can probably deliver a lot more. I just wonder though about leadership, because obviously if you're speaking to leaders when you're in your 20s and you're speaking to leaders now, how leadership has changed over the past however many years.
Well, significantly, I think, but well, in some ways not at all. So there are some things that are still common, and actually this does vary dramatically by sector and by organization. So there are still companies that are run quite traditionally, but I guess the best version of a CEO or of leadership in organizations is much more people orientated, is much more driven by the topics you're bringing up, by compassion, by care, by the human factor. So in the old days, if you're really exaggerating, obviously it was a much more command and control, and a much more directive, and a much more distance between the C-suite and the rest of the organization. I think, we've seen it move. We've all seen it move dramatically over the last 20 years, 30 years. I think it's nuanced by company and by individual, though. It's difficult to generalize.
Yeah, but the overarching is that people-focused businesses is where
I think it's a combination of focusing on the people and the human talent, the human factor of the business, but also we'll come on to it, but revealing more of yourself and leading with more of a human side than just as a very formal. It's much more informal, it's much more communicative. Think about all the technology that we've got that we didn't have then. So there's a lot more communication, there's a lot more openness, and actually that's one of the risks for CEOs now, because there was a protection in the way they did it in the old days. Nowadays they're very, very exposed, and as we see with Boris or anybody else, things are happening all the time that they don't really realize are getting out into the public domain.
Yeah, they're under scrutiny all the time, and now
Absolutely.
Their life is on.
Even in their life, not just in their business life.
Yeah. But let's talk about actually the traits of a good leader and what you're seeing now, and what I know you wrote a piece recently and you talked about compassion. So I'd love to hear about why compassion matters, but also what are some of the other traits that leaders have that actually mean that they are the ones that get the best out of their people.
Yeah, now this is a topic obviously that everybody's written about, and so this is very much off the top of my head, but I think the best leaders show balance. So I can constantly say they're balancing decisiveness with a bit of consensus, authority with understanding others, being very, very human and caring, but actually also quite tough. So the best leaders seem to do both. They're not all one, they're not all any of those things. They're doing it all, and they're juggling it, and they're flexing their style and flexing their abilities and capabilities with everybody. They listen well. They ask questions well. They're curious. They're obviously intelligent. They usually know their industry inside out. They're strategically ambitious, so they're looking beyond the obvious all those things you'd expect. But there's definitely this ability to bring in more of their caring, vulnerability, human sort of reality, if you like, of themselves, but also of their sort of caring of other individuals. And groups of individuals. But I think if I summed it up, it would be about their ability to balance the hard and the soft.
That's really interesting. And I know you wrote something about compassion and bringing compassion into the business. Why does that matter so much more now?
Well, I think the pandemic has made everybody realize on a personal level and a human level that we are all just trying to survive in our own little worlds, and that we've all had a window into each other's lives in a different way, because the stories that we're all revealing to each other and the attitude of each other, of people in their work setting, but has included much more about their personal life, their personal challenges. How are they going to juggle the kids when they're suddenly all working from home, schooling from home? How are they going to connect with their teams in a way that they've not had to, because it's just been so natural when we've been in the office? How are they going to have to think differently about how their teams are struggling? How are they going to look for the signs of stress and the signs of, people not coping? How do we have a conversation about fear and our own personal worries about the pandemic, particularly earlier on when it was really unclear what was going to happen next? So that has opened a conversation for people in the workplace that nobody had nobody had as a norm day to day at all levels, board level down, C-suite level down, to shop floor, and they are doing now. And it's coming from both sides. It's not just senior people asking quite formally, how are you? It's real issues coming up. I mean, there was a lovely, a client of ours, I probably shouldn't say who it is, but a really big client that we'd all know, and we know well. Did a brilliant week in the middle of the second lockdown, probably about a year ago, where they had senior leaders on one day talking about, as a parent, how do I cope at the moment? And they had a massive workshop for they've got 50,000 employees in the UK alone, but they're a global company. But they had all levels coming to this workshop to talk about parenting in this time. And then another day they had one on bereavement, because a lot of people, they happen to have had an exco where I think 5 out of 10 of the exco had lost somebody in the last 18 months, not all because of COVID, but usually related. It was remarkable because I haven't heard quite that many people in one group. But that led to them all having a workshop around bereavement and how do we cope with it and how do we support each other and what does it mean? And then they had another one about young people who are working from home and feeling very isolated. So they had a really practical, but all about the human dynamic and the human sort of challenges that we were all facing at that moment. And I was really impressed, actually, because it was quite quickly off the mark. And they were bang on the right topics.
Yeah, and what's so nice about that is, like, these are all things that all of us will go through, whether you're a leader, whether you're just starting your career. At any point, we all go through these different things that happen in our life that are going to impact us. And before, we could just shut the door, walk into work, and pretend they never happened. And now, actually, employees are craving to be able to share things, but they also want to hear the stories of their leaders.
It was lovely hearing that the very senior, they were picking senior leaders who were willing to open up about it and talk about their own challenges and how they've handled it, and have this sort of conversation in public about their own challenges with it, and which is brilliant.
Yeah. And how did the employees respond to that, and how did the business respond to that? Off the back?
Really positively. I mean, the first couple of sessions, I don't think they had many people join, as in 1,000 or 500 rather than, but by the end they were maxed out. They were in several thousand people coming onto a call to listen to these things. It was really impressive, but it says a lot about that leadership and how open they were willing to be.
Yeah. And let's talk about actually leaders and their response to COVID. So obviously things changed from one day to the next. How did things specifically change for leaders?
That's again a very general question. So different leaders, different situations. So in some sectors, so the airline sector, it went into complete crisis. Like, how are we going to survive this? And it was quite financially based, and it was, there was an element which was, we have to furlough this many people, and there was an operational side of it, but then it became very quickly financial survival, and it has until very recently continued to be in the airlines I know I'm working with. There were retailers that actually were overwhelmed with work, but they were challenged by the fact that the head office were all working from home, but you have the supermarket chains where all the everybody else in the chain, the supply chain, is working normally, and actually under a lot more stress than usual, because there's even more business than usual. And then you've got others like the financial services world, where you're trying to run a bank from home, and they were sort of like, this is actually incredible, we actually can run the bank from home. So they were almost surprising themselves, in the first lockdown in particular, how well they managed to sort of cope very quickly, shifting to a place where nobody actually went in the office. There's another angle, which is the boards became quite active. So in those first few months, the companies and the exec teams got into crisis mode. How do we handle our own personal business issues and our own circumstances? But then you got boards who were normally very formal and coming in, maybe meeting every month or even less than that, wanting to meet every week. And you can imagine, as an exec team, actually in some ways that's the last thing you need. And often the non-execs are less experienced at this particular business and in the detail, but they wanted to be in because they didn't want to they wanted to help and they wanted to be involved and they felt responsible. So that was quite a different challenge for some organizations. And also PE firms particularly got quite heavy-handed in their management of the exec teams. For a while, I think they backed off, within a year or so, we found that they'd sort of gone back to a more normal pace. But even now, there are some companies where the boards are talking about now going back to a more business as usual rhythm. I think there's a real difference between different organizations and the things they were worrying about. But obviously,
depending on depending on that business's situation, but I guess either way, you need to have there's some good leaders and there's some bad leaders. Yeah. So what did those good leaders tap into to get?
Well, the good leaders, that's a really good question. The good leaders got their teams together very often. So it started with and stayed with communication. So they got them together. I think the top teams I worked with were talking for half an hour every day, usually having a wrap-up call every afternoon. So they were talking more. They were being more decisive. They were therefore making decisions quicker and using less data and less sort of procrastination to get to a point where they could make decisions, which was really refreshing. And there was a bit probably 6 months into the pandemic where we started talking. There's probably a thing on our blog, on our LinkedIn about it, because I remember us discussing a lot, how do we bottle this? Because it felt really good. I mean, it was scary and there was stress in it, but there was a real coming together of teams. And so a lot of the conversation with teams about a year ago was, how do we keep this feeling as a team? Because we're really bonding. So going back to your question, how did the leaders respond? I think they brought their teams really close together. They listened. Some of them very clearly divided, business as usual with crisis management sub-teams or committees, but kept it very fluid and active. But I think the real thing was they kept energy, they kept very close, high communication, and they were very decisive.
Something just popped up as you were saying that. It's that idea of sort of doing something as a beginner, because no one had actually gone through this before. And so when you do something like you've never done it before, you have all this new creativity.
That's true. Yeah, and somehow no question's the wrong question to ask, and it gives people the opportunity to challenge the way we've always done things, because it's not realistic right now, which is really refreshing.
And are some of the leaders that you're talking to thinking there is a way to get back to normal, or are leaders still pretty comfortable with the uncertainty, I guess, is what I'm thinking?
I think they're very much more comfortable with the uncertainty than they were a year ago or even 6 months ago. I think it's become more normal. So when anybody says when we get back to normal, people are just saying, what normal? There's never going to be it's never going to be back to where it was. It's just working out what's going to be stable for how long. And I think the biggest problem with, obviously, is the uncertainty, both on a personal level, which we'll come back to in terms of well-being, but in terms of business decisions and business operations, how we don't know. I'm working with a train company. They don't know how many passengers are ever going to go on a railway again. They're like, we actually don't know. We had this commuter business. 80% of our passengers were commuters. We for sure they're not going to be 80% anymore. But how do we know? How do we get people back on the railway? So to go back to your question, it's not clear. And I think, again, every sector is different, but there is a remarkable amount of leadership that are just working. Everybody's incredibly flexible. People are flexing with what's in front of them. It's harder to think longer term right now, but they all know they have to. So everybody's trying to think, how do we vision the future? And in some sectors they really can, and others it's less. Probably the railway one is probably one of the hardest ones in a way. A lot of the retailers, I think, are pretty sure it may go more, the percentage to online is higher, but the business is, they've proven that as soon as they open their doors, people still buy. So it might not be quite the same level, or it might be slightly different and it's a different product, but they do know they've still got a business.
And what about hybrid? So now that businesses are able to start allowing employees to come back in, how are leaders adapting to their approach for hybrid?
This is a fascinating one, because about a year ago, we started having groups of between 10 and 20 senior CPO together online to discuss this topic, thinking it would be a sort of 2 or 3 session, and it went on for maybe a year. So people are still talking about how we do it, but most companies have had a policy that they put in place in the autumn, and they've probably had to revert. And now it's frustrating, because they sort of got to a point where everybody had a plan and had announced it and had started operating it and getting people back. Some companies very clearly with a mandate, you must be back 2-3 days a week, and others very, very loose, surprisingly loose, I think.
And is that based on the leadership?
Yeah.
Is that based on the leader?
Right. So yes. So basically, you have some organisations that felt sometimes it's about the formality and the culture of the organization, which is a little bit more, let's say, parental, or sort of giving clear guidance on everything. Others, so I've got some sort of, let's say, big insurance, I'm generalizing, but big insurance company, you know, absolutely going to go back to 2 or 3 days a week. I need you in the office. You can make your own decision within your team. As a leader, decide when you think the right times to come in, but you need to make sure they're in the office every 2 or 3 weeks, but make it logical so that you have your team meetings together on those days, blah, blah, blah. Other organizations, Amazon was one of them, where they'd said they were going to do 2 to 3 days a week, and the UK team were really comfortable with that. And then when the new CEO came in, he said, actually, I think it's a differentiator for us to be 100% flexible. So he actually reverted that decision. And then I don't know if he's reverted it since, but I understood that he'd said everybody can come in whenever they feel it's right. Now, as a leader, you then have to use your own judgment in your team and say, look, we want to we need to be together sometimes. So let's plan it together and plan our diaries. It's taking a lot more planning of diaries because everybody's not given to be in.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the idea of hybrid brings up a lot more challenges, but also that idea of actually going completely flexible means that as a leader or a team manager or whatever group you're looking after, that there needs to be a lot of trust too.
Yeah.
Which ultimately requires communication.
That's true, but it's interesting. That is interesting, because I think at the very beginning, the senior leaders were really impressed and surprised how much they could trust their teams, because everybody was really showing up online and really delivering. In fact, productivity went up in those first 6 months, let's say. I think over the last summer, there was a bit of chat of, I can't get them back in the office. I think it's because the weather's good, and I don't think they want to come back to the office yet, but I'm hoping they will in the autumn. And the companies that were trying to get them in too early were getting a lot of resistance. I think the trust is quite high. I think the trust, if you ask before the pandemic to now, I think generally people trust others to turn up, show up, have the same efficiency or productivity, if not better, than before. So I don't think that question of, if you're working from home, will you actually work, is there in general as much. There are some very obvious and funny, I think quite funny examples of where that's fallen down. But generally, I think people are quite surprised actually about all levels. I think one of the other surprises is that the more junior people who you'd think would want to work from home are actually, because they're isolated, actually really, and they learn more from others as they're in growing up a company, are really wanting to be back in the office.
And what are employees now calling the shots more than
definitely
management?
I think in lots of companies they've got more say, or they think they've got more say, and I think this is one of the balances for the poor CPO or people officer, because you often have them saying we've got to do the right thing for the organization, and they're listening to the people, and then you've got the exec team going, we've got to get them back in the office, we need to get back to where we were, and we need to get the momentum going, you know. So I think yes, they certainly have. And one section of all in companies that I think have had quite a big voice is the tech teams. So the technology teams in, most companies have a strong tech team, but they are so, what's the word? They're so in demand, and there is a real shortage of them of all ages and stages, from graduates up to CTOs and CPOs, product officers, rather than people officers, that they are having a louder voice than you would expect. So I've got a couple of clients where they've made a decision that you must be back in the office 2 or 3 days a week, all been agreed, it's all started to go into place, but the tech teams have just refused point blank. And it's really interesting because they've ended up backing off and letting them because they want to keep them.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I was actually speaking to someone yesterday, and he said, he comes from the tech world. He said, we were all remote 10 years ago. So this is nothing new. I was so used to working with my teams remotely, and we made it work. So actually his business, it's been fine transitioning because they were used to it. But he was saying exactly the same thing, that they're in such high demand that actually they're much more able, the tech teams.
And I think if companies force them back into the office, they will lose them because there are so many people who are now really comfortable with everybody working remotely.
I want to just switch over to sort of the mental state of leaders and workers and just talk about a little bit about well-being. What are you seeing within some of the companies that you're working with and how they're thinking about well-being and what they're doing for their employees?
So on the one-to-one coaching level, so when we're working with individual leaders and CEOs in particular, we're seeing a lot of more discussion about it, a lot more it coming up in conversation about their concern about people and concern about the organization and concern about the individuals in their teams and thinking about it and reflecting on it and acting on it. If I'm really honest, I don't know if it's that much structured organizational, organized well-being in place yet. I think it's a topic they're discussing. I think there's a number of different CPOs who are really, it's really high on their agenda. And there are some people that have put, like I described before, workshops online and a lot more, and some sort of, what's the word, emergency call out type support. If you need counselling, if you need help, this is where you go, there's that sort of thing in place, but there's not much more than that. It's a topic, it's there, but it's not in concrete plans or activities, I don't think, in many organizations.
Sort of, it sounds like they know they need to offer something, do something, but they're not sure what it is. And nothing is necessarily, well, and it's not a one size fits all for every employee and definitely not every company.
No, but it's interesting because again, this is completely random. Actually, I was coaching a CEO yesterday who basically said, look, we were talking about what the priorities are in the next couple of years. And he said the 3 priorities: mental health, well-being, and sustainability in his sector. And there were some business commercial ones which were more about growth, but basically they were the things that he said, I need to get a very clear strategy, a really clear point of view on it, and get it out into business because they know we care about them, but they're not seeing it.
Yeah. And it comes back to then, how can that employee know what they're showing up for if they don't necessarily feel good and they're not connected to the purpose?
And it goes back to old habits, which is if I show my own vulnerability, mental health vulnerability, or any other well-being aspect, it seems like a weakness, and therefore I won't get a promotion, or I won't, get the same, I won't be seen the same way. Yeah. I think that's still there, even though we've come a long way over the last.
And how are some of the CPOs and leaders defining well-being?
I don't know whether I can generalize because I think each one's different. I think it's probably around a bit of balance of life, a bit of mental health in the extreme sense of that, but also well-being being the stage before it gets to mental health, i.e. getting your exercise and fresh air routine, right? So both exercise and not sitting at a screen all the time. It's probably around, people still talk about, what you're consuming in terms of food and drink, and all those obvious, very basic things, and sleep. And then that leads you to the question about stress. So where's stress sitting in that, and where's stress impacting those things? So I think they're the sort of main categories of where people think about well-being, but I'm not sure they have a solution very clearly. I might be wrong, but I don't think so.
Is there an appetite to invest in well-being?
Yes, conceptually.
Just not know, but they just don't know what
I think that's right. I don't think they know where, and I don't think they know where they'd get bang for their buck. Where will they get a return on investment? And how will they measure it? Right.
Well, and that's the ongoing question. How do you measure this? And it is, from when we speak to clients, it's not an instant overnight solution. You're in it for the long haul. We had a big conversation with Jen Fisher, who's the Chief Wellbeing Officer at Deloitte. And Brilliant. They started their program 7 years ago. And she said, what we needed 7 years ago was what we needed then. There's different things we need now, but it's not, we get to a destination and tick, we've done it. It's a continuous evolution of the program based on what the needs of the employees are at that specific moment in time. Yeah. And there's always specific leaders that do it, are very committed to well-being. And then there's others that we have to have a bigger conversation with and just remind them a little bit.
I think there's two, I'd be really curious to know her perspective on it, because I feel that there's something about, as a leader, how do I tackle this topic? How do I talk to my people about this? How do I ask the questions that I wouldn't have dared ask a few years ago? What are the signs I'm looking for that make me, with any of my direct reports or the teams beneath them, that, flag a red flag, a problem that I should solve. So there's that whole, as a leader, what do I do? And then there's as a leader, what do I say? So what can I say? What is really sort of out of bounds? What is in my remit and what isn't? And then lastly, what can we, as an organization, what can we actually do? And I think that probably comes down to a menu of different things, that because everybody's own personal well-being is very different, and we all hold it differently and think about it differently.
Practice it in different ways, or in our bodies, both our mental body and our physical body need different. Will want to consume well-being in a different way. That said, sleep, fundamental. We all need to sleep. And nutrition, we might have slightly different diets, but processed food is bad for all of us, basically. But then the other parts of well-being, it can be specific. What we found actually is that the feeling of well-being is actually quite similar. So what you're attaining from being well, it actually helps you with a sense of purpose, and builds up resilience, which is what a lot of the businesses that we've spoken to over the past 2 years have been needing.
And actually, that's where they started. Yeah. So people, as soon as we went into crisis, resilience became the thing. And there's lots of companies that are putting resilience workshops in place. And I think, going back to what I'm saying, as a leader, what am I looking for? It's probably the signs of lack of resilience, but also the word resilience in itself is a judgment, isn't it? Because if you're not resilient, you're not coping, you're not capable, you're not promotable, so it's a really great concept, but I do worry about the overuse of the terminology.
We should all just be speaking about being well, feeling good in our body, physically, mentally, and then committed to what we're doing, feeling purposeful. I'm just curious, just to wrap things up, just about leaders specifically practicing their own well-being, and if you have conversations with them about that.
Yes, constantly. Almost every session, I would say, we touch on it.
And what are they doing for their well-being?
Some are better than others. Some are still struggling with the pressures of running their businesses. But I would say most people have gone through a real low point over the last 18 months at some point where they thought, actually, no, I've got to do something differently. So I would say the best ones have definitely got exercise in there every day. As you mentioned, nutrition, I think a lot of them are using meditation in a way that they haven't used it in the past. And I think, and they may call it other things, but it is basically meditation. And actually, we're finding that talking therapy, whether it's coaching or counselling or something, where they can actually talk through and think about it and make it very conscious, to use your word, is probably where they're at, and the best ones are doing it, definitely. And actually, it's become a bit of a non-issue for quite a few senior leaders who were very stressed maybe a year in the past at different points, who I'm finding are really actually in control of this now, of their own personal well-being, which is probably why they're now able to think about well-being for their organizations, actually.
Yeah, because they've sort of gone through that journey and now realize, oh, wow, and focusing on me, I can actually give more.
See the benefit.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay, and Becky, final question. What do you do for your well-being?
Oh, okay. You do put me on the spot. I've got a Peloton, which I bought before the pandemic, but only about completely brilliantly about 8 weeks before the pandemic. I bought a Peloton, and I go on the Peloton every day. Some days for longer than others, but I usually try and get at least half an hour in. And then I live in the country, so I walk the dogs. I used to run, and so actually at different points in the pandemic, I ran quite a lot, but with a couple of different knee and aches and pains, I'm now doing longer dog walks and the Peloton. And then I'm not drinking particularly. I've never been a great drinker. I don't really like. I'll drink socially, but I'm not an everyday drinker at all. So I don't drink very much. And I'm trying. My weight has always fluctuated, but I'm trying at the moment to be super good again. I went through a phase of being a little bit less controlled, but I'm back to being good.
With the little blip every once in a while, just to treat yourself, because
it's funny. It's one of those things over your life, you get to know what you can cope with and can't. And I now don't see it as a big deal. I don't even think of it as a diet. I'm just my life is slightly less indulgent during the week, I'd say. And at certain nights out, I'll let myself eat what I like. But it does make a difference.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's finding, as we all grow older, you sort of start to know what works for your body and what doesn't work, whether it's food, whether it's, the type of exercise. But I love that you get outside, because actually just getting
and I try and get outside during the day. That's the challenge. So when you're tied to this and you've got back-to-back calls, I've ended up having to schedule at least one gap, the lunchtime hour, so that I can physically walk away from the screen. And actually, without that, I would probably go a little bit crazy. And I try and go out for a walk before I sit down in the first thing in the morning as well. It's nice being in the country because you can do that. But even in,
But I think for most out there, that they're like you, tied to a computer and having a lot of calls, and it is like whatever you need to do to actually remind yourself to actually just get up and take a little bit of a break, even that's just to go get a cup of tea, or to just step outside or open a window if you're in an apartment or a flat. Just having a little bit of break from the screen.
One of the biggest shocks for me at the beginning of the pandemic was as lots of people, measure our steps. And when I was pre-pandemic, I was doing maybe 12,000 steps a day without running, as in just walking around London, going to different clients and, walking a bit between things. And then suddenly those steps went to literally nothing. It was really shocking. So it movement, full stop, movement, end of, whatever it is. Swim, walk, run, cycle.
Amazing. Well, I hope you keep that up. Becky, this has been amazing. Thank you very much for being my first guest on Conscious Leaders. You've provided loads of insight into what's happening in the world of work and with leaders. And hopefully we'll get you back on here in a little bit to talk more about that next stage, whatever that next stage of uncertainty turns into.
Yeah, I'd love to. Lovely to see you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you in the next episode. And by the way, if you like what you heard, then hit subscribe to receive all the future episodes. Better yet, if you're feeling inspired by what you just heard, then leave a review letting me know who else you might want to hear from on Conscious Leaders. To learn more about the show, about conscious working, or Tribe, our membership, head over to our website, consciousworking.co. Yes, it's just CO. So consciousworking.co. And for those of you that might be suffering burnout, we have a great free resource, the Beat Burnout Guide. It's a really simple assessment with tools for you to take action now. Check it out in the show notes so that you can access it immediately. See you in the next episode. Be here and be well.